I will have a lot more content coming down the chute because I'm excited to discuss all the many and varied aspects of this beautiful Switch 2 presentation. But if there is a dark cloud on the horizon for many, it is the price announcements. Not just $449 for the machine on its own, with $499 for the version which has a Mario Kart World Pack-in title, but also, of course, $80 for the Mario Kart World game on its own, and more in some territories. On the other hand, the still expensive but relatively modest $70 is the price given for Donkey Kong Bonanza, and there is another pricing mystery: the decision by Nintendo to launch a Japanese language only model for the domestic market that is somewhat cheaper than the international equivalent, which plays a range of different languages besides just Japanese. So, what is going on with Nintendo's pricing? Let's discuss it. Note that this is not a video designed to rage against the price choices or shrug them off, but simply to analyze how these prices function in the context of the landscape Nintendo finds itself in. Obviously, it is a pretty cruddy thing for consumers to wear, and has certainly taken the sheen off Nintendo's big day for many, but sadly it's not a complete surprise. Look, I've discussed price previously and extensively. When I examined the console prices last year and went back through the history of previous console prices, both for Nintendo and for other major video game companies, we concluded that, inflation adjusted, most Nintendo consoles launched at around $400 in today's term, with the original Switch actually being a little cheaper than most of their competitors. There are examples of where companies have pushed too far in the past. The Sega Saturn in 1995 and the PlayStation 3 in 2006 were definitely examples of these, where, inflation adjusted, they were more towards the $600 plus range. Generally, though, these consoles were released at times where other consoles were also raising prices relative to the standard of the market, and it was the slightly cheaper variant, although still expensive, that got the benefit, slipstreaming the more expensive model that got all the criticism. In this case, if you class PlayStation 5 and Xbox as the direct competitors for the Nintendo Switch 2, which they are, at least insofar as Switch 2 offers higher end gaming experiences now, then Switch 2 still benefits from being the relatively inexpensive option for this kind of experience. And with Switch 2 being a more fully featured high-end console and launching in an environment where there are many anxieties in terms of price, a slightly higher launch price was something I said I did expect, and $449 or $499 seemed plausible. As we approached, I did start to wonder, especially after Furukawa's comments in the February investors meeting, that they might try to find a way to get the price down to $399 and then go heavy on upselling people extra stuff, but I think they needed to hit that psychological ceiling of $499 on at least one of the models to give themselves room to stick at this price for the duration of the console's life if there are market difficulties. Now, as I say, from a consumer's perspective, this does seem pretty cruddy, not just dealing with the cost of living pressures, but now the prices of video games are being bumped up. As it happens, game consoles and particularly games are actually far cheaper, inflation adjusted, than they were in decades gone by, but that doesn't mean as much when other things are much more expensive. So, what is going on? Well, firstly, Nintendo has a reputation for not selling consoles at a loss. This is a little bit of a misnomer. Both the 3DS and the Wii U were sold at losses for a period of time, mainly because of exchange rate difficulties for the company during the early 2010s. Now, the exchange rates are generally pretty favourable for Nintendo, but the American government's explicit aim is to engineer a weaker dollar to boost American exports, and this is going to mean that Nintendo's profits per system sold in the US, a major market for them, will fall. This also goes some way to explaining the Japanese-only version for the home market that is cheaper. Selling domestically is usually far easier because you don't have the anxieties about exchange rates, or at least only indirectly, through the consequences further up the supply chain. But in these days of speedy international shipping, it really opens the market up to scalpers in a big way. So making a Japanese language only edition cheaper protects their market a little bit, but is also a way to ensure that price modulations designed to respond to international circumstances do not dent, as far as possible, Nintendo's standing in what has to be their most important territory, Japan. And this may seem exclusionary, but from Nintendo's point of view, they are first and foremost a Japanese company, and the bulk of their employees, their contacts, and their good name are Japanese. If they fail to convince the Japanese to move to the new platform, then they really are in trouble. Whereas if they build a strong Japanese base and continue to inspire new generations to engage with Nintendo, some of whom doubtless will be the Nintendo developers of tomorrow, then they can deal with the international market situation when the time comes. Of course, the price for all the consoles is still high, as they have the same pressures that hit Nintendo and have hit every other consumer tech company. Sourcing chips is becoming more expensive, and there are potentially high outlays that Nintendo needs to hedge against in the future. There are also risks in terms of supply chains. Nintendo has employed, as best as we can tell, a China plus two strategy, with Malaysia and Vietnam being used to manufacture consoles in addition to China, allowing them a little bit more flexibility with their supply chains if needed. It's not difficult to imagine the kinds of scenarios that might frustrate these supply chains, though, from trade wars to actual conflicts and sanctions being applied, and Nintendo needs, as far as possible, to be able to maintain its price in a variety of circumstances. It's always far, far more difficult to raise prices than it is to lower them. The actual consequences of American tariffs is, at this point, I feel, a minor factor here, simply because the situation is too fluid to really be able to tell anything for sure. The chances of retaliatory tariffs creating an unstable landscape is definitely problematic, but in 2019 and 2020, the strong footing of the video game industry in the USA helped the industry carve an opt-out from proposed tariffs proposed during that period. Of course, a high price in this sense is a hedge for Nintendo. It's far easier, again, to initiate a price drop than to have a price increase. I also think there is an anchoring effect. Anchoring is when you announce a high price to recalibrate expectations going forward. They know that the $500 range is where this system needs to be for the long term, and while it currently seems like that would struggle to compete with the lower end of the Microsoft and Sony output, that's not really their focus right now. And in any event, in a few years' time, both companies will doubtless have surged past Nintendo on price for their next-gen entries. The $80 price for Mario Kart World especially serves as a very important benchmark for them. Essentially, they have replicated their approach with Tears of the Kingdom, which is that those rare quadruple A, absolutely mega games get the $10 uplift over their usual price. $70 is the top price for most games, with even Donkey Kong priced at $70, despite appearing to be a very large, fully featured open game. $80 then is their way of putting it just a bit over the top. And most people won't pay $80 for Mario Kart because they clearly want to shepherd people into buying it at launch. And of course, if people buy it as a launch game, the chances of it doing absolutely bonanza numbers and potentially even eclipsing Mario Kart 8 Deluxe do increase. At least as well, they want to get people buying the digital version, integrating more Mario Kart players into the Nintendo ecosystem even more deeply. So yes, $80 is a shock. I'm not defending it per se, but I understand it, and I actually think it might pay off for them in the long term when they announce $80 for subsequent quadruple A titles. Look, I'm not saying I want it to be more expensive, but we've got to consider their rationale. This system is almost certainly going to be selling for a decade hence, and they know Mario Kart will sell like hotcakes, particularly as a bundle game. Therefore, they can figure that most people will see the bundle as a good deal, with that perception of value possibly distracting them from the high price of the system. This also sets that marker down for future games, and it's not one that I think they might use very often. In fact, I think the games that could justify such a price bump are rare and probably can be counted on your fingers. But when such games emerge, your Zeldas and Super Smash Bros., they have front-loaded the pain of breaking that price barrier. They are also very clearly steering people into digital purchases through this, a method that not only means they get a bigger cut of the pie, but also locks people into the Nintendo Switch 2 ecosystem even more tightly. I am a physical game fan, but I must admit it's persuasive to get the bundle just for the better price, and I'm going to have to think very carefully about what price my principles are, especially given the convenience of being able to load up a game like Mario Kart World anytime, anywhere. I think this increases the likelihood that Nintendo could try and launch a digital console at some point this generation. Again, there is a kind of anchoring effect to having people go digital on day one. Once people have gone digital once, it becomes a lot easier for people to stay digital again and again and again in the future, and I think this is something that they very much want to encourage. The other reality we have to face is that people simply will pay that price. The demand for Switch 2 is still really high. The supply of the console, however well they've defended against scalping, is going to be fixed for a time as there is a physical limit to their production and storage capabilities, however high that limit may be. So price is one way of dampening some early adoption. Of course, they don't want it to be so pricey that they put people off forever, but I really think there will be a very solid run of games in the years ahead to keep people hooked into the Nintendo ecosystem. Mario Kart, Donkey Kong, Metroid Prime 4, and Pokemon Legends ZA are huge titles. Kirby Air Riders is big because of the Sakurai name and Kirby's newfound status post Forgotten Land, and they haven't even talked about 3D Mario, let alone other big franchises like Zelda, Animal Crossing, and Splatoon, or really anything groundbreaking or original from the EPD4 stable of developers that we just know have to have something up their sleeve, let alone Fire Emblem or many other franchises that are surely still in the post. People might not buy on day one, but in the long term, Switch 2 is a sure bet, and I suspect it's unlikely that people will go elsewhere because those specific Nintendo experiences simply can't be found elsewhere. Now, there is a precedent before where it all went badly wrong for Nintendo. The 3DS launched at such a high price that they not only had to do a price cut and an apology tour, issuing some free games, something Nintendo is psychologically opposed to doing, but they did in this case, but by 2012 they were releasing an XL version of the system, seemingly to eclipse the original model. I've seen a lot of people already predicting that Switch 2 sales numbers will disappoint as a result of this change. But honestly, I don't see it, and there are a couple of reasons for this, some of which are a little bit of sleight of hand, but will still be important for the way Nintendo presents things. So first of all, 3DS was a sequel to a similarly hugely popular console, but it was released much earlier in the DS's life, and the system launched with, frankly, not very much in the way of mega exciting games. Already we can see that this is a very different situation for Switch 2, and I don't for a second think they're done announcing games for 2025 while they haven't even begun to touch on the 2026 lineup. And don't underestimate the hype effect of the two movies coming up. Super Mario Bros. Movie 1 saw a huge uplift in sales for that quarter in 2023. I think Nintendo will get a boost at launch, a boost at Christmas, a boost after the Mario movie in April, and so they have plenty of big events that should insulate them against people who are upset about the price opting out. They will still be able to sell at a very steady pace, and the longer they go, the better the library of games they will have available, and the more pressure there will be for people who are already Nintendo fans to opt into the new hardware ecosystem. Sadly, being a bit cheeky on price is not just something that Nintendo has a long history of themselves, but is unfortunately basic marketing. Yes, you don't want to go too high, but equally going too low is also a killer. A $50 per console diminution of potential profits across 100 million units sold is a difference of billions of dollars, and Nintendo ultimately is in business and seeking to maximize growth and revenue for its shareholders. It's hard to wear, but I think they've done enough to crowd out the cries of despair about price personally. Now, will it sell as well as the original Switch? Over the long term, that was always a challenge, and I'll talk about that in due course perhaps, but in the short term, remember that the original Switch was hit by supply delays early on, and its software support was extremely thin after its launch year. In fact, even in its launch year, there were plenty of months and a half gaps between first-party games, and while some were Breath of the Wild quality, there were also games like ARMS and Splatoon 2 that grew over time, but launched relatively bare bones. If you're comparing 2025 sales to 2020, then sure, Switch 2 will be behind the pace, but I think there's a decent chance Nintendo will be able to claim that they are outpacing Switch 1 in a like-for-like comparison, and given the 1-2 punch of the movies, they are likely to be far ahead of Switch's sales in like-for-like graphs for the medium term at least. The time it will be tricky is where we get to year 4, which is where Switch sales really exploded during the pandemic, and Nintendo will want to hope that Switch 2 is sufficiently embedded in the market by that point that the negative comparison will not be such a concern for them. Check out the Patreon for some thoughts on Mario Kart, and there'll be more stuff both here and there over the coming days. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.